Imagine this: a dedicated mother, Emma, just returning from maternity leave, eager to balance her career and motherhood. She's doing everything right, juggling work deadlines and breastfeeding, but something unexpected happens. She's fired. Fired for simply doing what any loving mother would do. Sounds outrageous, doesn't it? But the story doesn't end there. What follows is a chain of events no one could have predicted, leading Emma down a path that will change not only her life, but the lives of countless others. Ever wondered what it takes to fight back against workplace discrimination? What Emma does next will make you question everything you thought you knew about fairness, rights, and resilience. But before we dive into Emma's incredible journey, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you don't want to miss the rest of this story. Let's get into it. Emma stepped back into the bustling office after a 6-month maternity leave, juggling her role as a new mother and senior account manager. She felt a swirl of emotions: excitement to be back, but also the weight of responsibility to prove she hadn't lost her edge. As she glanced at the emails piling up in her inbox, the reality of balancing breastfeeding and her career hit hard. Yet, she was determined to show she could handle it all. Her first day back was met with smiles, but beneath the surface, she could sense a subtle shift. "Oh, Emma, you've got your hands full now, don't you?" one colleague chuckled. She smiled, but inside, she couldn't help but wonder if they saw her differently now. During lunch, she joined a group of coworkers, eager to catch up, but the conversation quickly turned to work she had missed. As they discussed new projects, Emma realized no one had thought to include her in certain key decisions. Was it just an oversight, or was there more to it? Her phone buzzed, reminding her it was time to pump. She excused herself, heading to the designated room, feeling like she had to hide this part of her life. "I'll just be quick," she thought, but the clock ticked too fast. As she returned to her desk, the whispered conversations seemed louder, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that being a mother had suddenly become a mark against her. It wasn't just the subtle exclusions that stung. The real pressure came from within. Every task, every meeting felt like a test. Emma found herself working longer hours, eager to prove that motherhood hadn't slowed her down. She'd glance at the photo of her baby on her desk, feeling a pang of guilt for not being home. But she pushed those thoughts aside, determined to excel in both worlds. "I can do this," she reminded herself, but doubt crept in with each passing day. The balance she so desperately sought was proving harder to achieve than she had imagined. By the end of the week, the cracks were beginning to show. Emma sat in her car after work, staring at the steering wheel. She loved her baby, loved her job, but how was she supposed to keep up with both? Her mind raced with thoughts of unfinished tasks and missed moments with her child. And as she drove home, the nagging feeling of being pulled in too many directions lingered, setting the stage for the challenges that were about to unfold at work. The next week would test her in ways she hadn't anticipated. But Emma, resilient as ever, was about to find out just how tough she truly was. As the weeks passed, Emma began to notice subtle, almost imperceptible changes in how her colleagues treated her. It wasn't overt, but she could feel the distance growing. Once an integral part of every major project, she now found herself being left out of important meetings. It started with small things. Her name wasn't on the invite list, or a meeting was rescheduled without anyone informing her. At first, she chalked it up to a misunderstanding. "They probably just forgot," she told herself, but deep down, Emma knew something was different. The whispered conversations and sideways glances became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk, Emma overheard two coworkers talking in the hallway. "Do you think she can handle it all now?" one voice said, followed by a faint laugh. Emma's heart sank. She had always been the go-to person for high-stakes projects, and now it seemed her colleagues doubted her abilities. The worst part? No one had said anything to her face. It was all done in hushed tones, as if her identity as a mother had suddenly overshadowed her professional reputation. And yet, Emma was determined not to let this bias get to her, even though it hurt more than she cared to admit. The tipping point came during a team brainstorming session. Emma had been preparing for days, ready to pitch her ideas, but when she arrived, it became clear that the major decisions had already been made, without her input. She sat in silence as her colleagues discussed strategies she knew nothing about. It was as if she had become invisible. Am I not part of this team anymore? She thought, frustration building inside her. But she held her tongue, not wanting to seem emotional. After all, the unspoken rule was that mothers had to prove they weren't distracted by their personal lives. And Emma was tired of having to prove herself, again and again. The isolation only grew worse with time. Emma noticed that the emails she used to receive about new projects were now going to someone else. The lunches she once shared with coworkers had dwindled down to solo breaks at her desk, but she couldn't bring herself to confront anyone about it. Maybe it's all in my head, she tried to convince herself. But deep down, Emma knew better. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just her workload. It was the way people saw her now, not as the dedicated professional she had always been, but as a mother who might not fit the role anymore. This quiet exclusion was just the beginning, and Emma's resolve to fight back was growing stronger with each passing day. The real confrontation came when Emma least expected it. One afternoon, she was in the designated room, pumping milk, trying to stay on top of her new routine while keeping up with work demands. It had become a necessary part of her day, one that she tried to keep as discreet as possible. But as she sat there, the door suddenly swung open, and in walked Mark, her manager. His expression was one of annoyance, not embarrassment, as one might expect. "Emma, really? Can't you do this at home?" he said, arms crossed, clearly frustrated. Emma froze, the discomfort palpable in the air. She felt exposed, not just physically but emotionally too. This was a part of her life she never expected to have to explain or justify. "Mark, I have the right to do this here. I need to pump during the day. It's not like I have a choice," she said, her voice steady but her heart racing. But Mark, dismissing her words, just sighed. "Well, maybe you should consider using formula. It would make things easier for everyone, don't you think?" His tone was casual, but the impact of his words hit hard. Emma couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her own boss, blatantly disregarding her rights. The tension in the room grew, but Mark didn't seem to care. "Look, I get it. Being a mom is tough, but we have work to do here. You're missing meetings, and people are starting to talk. I need you focused, not, well, distracted by this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the pump. Emma's hands clenched, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I am focused. I'm doing my job, Mark. You can't treat me like this just because I'm a mother," she said, her voice now laced with frustration. But Mark just shook his head, as if he was the one being inconvenienced. "I'm just saying, think about it," he muttered, before walking out, leaving Emma fuming and stunned. After the confrontation, Emma sat alone for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't just Mark's words that stung. It was the realization that her workplace wasn't the supportive environment she once believed it to be. She knew her rights, and what had just occurred was a clear violation. But as much as she wanted to stand up for herself, there was a part of her that feared the consequences. "What if I lose my job?" she thought, her mind racing. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let this slide. This was just the beginning of her fight, and Mark had no idea what was coming next. The days that followed felt like walking through quicksand for Emma. Every time she went to pump, the tension at work grew thicker, almost tangible. Her co-workers' whispered comments seemed louder, and the isolation became more pronounced. It was no longer just about missing meetings or being excluded from emails. There was an air of judgment around her every move. One afternoon, while heading back to her desk after pumping, she caught a snippet of a conversation between two colleagues. "I don't know how she manages to get anything done with all that baby stuff," one of them said, laughing under their breath. Emma's stomach dropped. These weren't just idle words, they were daggers meant to wound. Each day felt like a battle of endurance. Emma continued to pump, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, for her baby, for herself. But every time she did, the whispers grew louder, the exclusion more blatant. Meetings were held without her. Decisions were made behind her back, and projects she once led were quietly reassigned. Emma felt herself being pushed further and further into the margins. Am I really being punished for being a mother? She thought, the weight of it all pressing down on her. She tried to stay strong, but the growing isolation was taking its toll. One morning, Emma found herself standing outside a closed conference room, her name noticeably absent from the meeting invite. As she peeked through the glass door, she saw her team discussing the very project she had spearheaded before her maternity leave. Her heart sank as she realized she was being systematically erased from the workplace she had once thrived in. She felt a burning desire to confront them, to demand an explanation, but she knew deep down that the issue wasn't with just one person. It was the culture, one that no longer saw her as valuable because she dared to be both a mother and a professional. The turning point came when she overheard another snide remark, this time from someone she had once considered a friend at work. "It's like she's not even here half the time anymore," they said, and for the first time, Emma felt a tear slide down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, refusing to let anyone see her break. But inside, she knew this was more than just workplace bias. It was a systemic issue that so many mothers faced, quietly enduring the judgment and exclusion. Emma's isolation had reached its peak, but little did she know the next chapter of her journey would be far from silent. As Emma's situation worsened, she realized she couldn't fight this battle alone. One evening, after another exhausting day of subtle exclusions and outright discrimination, she sat down at her kitchen table and began researching labor rights. The more she read, the clearer it became. Her rights as a working mother had been blatantly violated. She had heard stories of women like her, silently enduring these injustices, but Emma was done staying quiet. "This is wrong," she muttered to herself, determined to take action. The next day, she reached out to a labor law attorney, a woman named Sarah, who specialized in workplace discrimination. Their first meeting was eye-opening. "You're not alone in this, Emma," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "What you're experiencing happens to so many women, but the law is on your side." Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, someone understood what she was going through, and there were legal avenues to fight back. Sarah advised her to start documenting everything: the meetings she was excluded from, the remarks made by colleagues, the confrontation with Mark. "The more evidence we have, the stronger your case will be," Sarah explained. Emma nodded, feeling empowered for the first time in weeks. As Emma began to keep meticulous records, the reality of her situation became even clearer. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all the women who had been pushed aside, dismissed, or made to feel less than because they chose to be both mothers and professionals. Each entry in her notebook felt like a step toward reclaiming her dignity. She wrote down the time, date, and details of every incident, knowing that one day, these words might help her stand in court and demand justice. "I won't let them get away with this," she thought, her resolve hardening with each passing day. The legal process was slow and filled with uncertainty, but Emma was ready for the fight. With Sarah's guidance, she prepared to file a formal complaint against her employer. It was a daunting step, but Emma knew it was the only way to hold them accountable. As she sat across from Sarah, signing the paperwork, she felt a mix of fear and determination. "What if they retaliate?" Emma asked, her voice wavering slightly. Sarah smiled gently. "They might try, but that's why we're here. You're doing the right thing, Emma, and trust me, this is just the beginning." Emma walked out of that office knowing she was no longer alone, and the fight for her rights was far from over. As Emma's legal battle gained momentum, Word of her story began to spread. It started small, just a few whispers among coworkers and acquaintances. But then, an unexpected opportunity came when a local journalist caught wind of her case. "We'd love to feature your story," the journalist said during a phone call. At first, Emma hesitated. She had always been a private person, never seeking the spotlight. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every working mother who had been silenced, sidelined, or made to feel lesser. And Emma knew that sharing her experience could help others find their voice. With a deep breath, she agreed to the interview. The article, titled "A Mother's Fight for Equality in the Workplace," quickly gained traction. Soon, national media outlets picked up the story, and Emma found herself thrust into a role she hadn't expected: a spokesperson for working mothers. Invitations to speak on podcasts and news shows flooded in, and though it was overwhelming, Emma saw it as a chance to push for real change. "It's not just my story," she told one reporter, her voice steady but passionate. "It's the story of countless women who deserve better. We need to create workplaces where mothers aren't forced to choose between their children and their careers." As the media coverage grew, so did Emma's platform. Mothers from all walks of life began reaching out, sharing their own stories of discrimination and hardship. Some had lost their jobs, while others had quietly endured the same exclusion and bias Emma had faced. Emma realized that her fight was part of a much larger movement, a movement that needed a voice. With newfound determination, she began advocating for workplace reforms, meeting with lawmakers, and pushing for stronger protections for working parents. "It's not just about pumping milk in the office," she said during one speech. "It's about dignity, respect, and the right to balance family and career." And then came the turning point. Emma's advocacy helped spark a national conversation that couldn't be ignored. Her voice, once silenced in the conference rooms of her workplace, now echoed through halls of power. Lawmakers began to take notice, and soon, Emma was working with a coalition of advocates to draft new legislation aimed at protecting the rights of working parents. She couldn't believe it. What had started as a deeply personal struggle had evolved into something much bigger. And as she stood on the steps of the Capitol, surrounded by other mothers, lawyers, and supporters, Emma knew that this was just the beginning. Her fight had become a catalyst for change, and she wasn't done yet. Moral of the story: Emma's story isn't just about one woman's fight, it's about all of us. It forces us to ask ourselves, how many mothers are quietly facing the same struggles, feeling like they have to choose between their careers and their children? It's a battle that's often invisible, but it's real, and it's happening all around us. As Emma stood up for herself, she stood up for everyone who has ever felt marginalized or pushed aside. Now it's your turn. What would you do in her shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to click the next video to see how Emma's fight for justice sparks a movement that changes the workplace for good. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications so you don't miss any updates. Together, we can keep this conversation going and continue learning how to create a fairer, more just world for everyone.